Previously, we've talked about the difficulty of being an ethical and an effective leader, some of the challenges that posed. In a similar way, you can think about the difficulty in achieving ethics within a business context. And if you already thought business ethics was problematic at a domestic level because of the drive to profitability, the difficulties that arise when we consider international operations make this problem even more acute. From some of the discussions we've had about CSR, a large part of the expected responsibility is derived from the huge access to resources of multinational corporations, allowing these same companies to have enormous influence over world events. What's also interesting here is thinking about the extent to which a global market actually exists. Regardless of this, while globalisation, broadly defined, offers the potential for positive development and the sharing of resources and skills, it also provides greater opportunity or incentive for unethical acts, lower taxes, cheaper labour, and avoiding social and environmental legislation. So the key questions we're going to be addressing today are to first of all define globalisation, to look at some of the trends that might be moving away from globalisation, and then finally to ask whether globalisation is ethically desirable. So first of all, we need to try and identify what we mean by globalisation. And the quote I've got there states that it's bringing societies that were previously economically, politically and culturally diverse into convergence. So this idea of convergence, again, is undoubtedly one part of this debate. But convergence into what exactly? Market norms? Americanisation? So it's perhaps easiest to define this in terms of what it looks like. So the four things that I've got mentioned here are not exhaustive, but give some broad idea of what most are referencing when they speak about globalisation. So for some people, this is just kind of shared experiences globally. So for example, Crane and Matten talk about watching the World Cup, drinking the same beer, eating the same food, internet banking wherever you are, and that sort of thing. And obviously this is maybe part of this. But perhaps a more important one is this idea of liberalisation. This is very much connected to free market economics and of opening up access for Western companies to the global South economies. And when we come on to speak then about foreign direct investment, similarly this always poses questions. For one thing, what have you had to do to enable those greater FDI flows? Are you reducing tax burdens, which has a direct impact on your ability to provide vital public services and infrastructure? Does the benefit of having more investment outweigh the costs of a reduced tax take? These are very much central arguments here. And if the first two are perhaps seen as controversial, the next two are often thought to be unproblematic, at least on first glance. However, when we're thinking about IT and communications and the idea of technological change, connecting and interacting with people on the other side of the world is obviously much easier now. And arguably, though, IT and technological growth in terms of trading and pricing has fed into a derivatives market which has arguably caused so much damage, known by some as financial weapons of mass destruction. As always, it's about how we use technology. As with anything else, we can use technology to cure cancer, or we can use it to drop bombs on people via drone strikes. Adorno once said that there is no history that leads from savagery to humanitarianism, but there is one that leads from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. And at the moment, we seem to be doing a good job of proving him correct. On the last point then, this idea of people and goods. So one example we can talk about is our access to travel, and that this can broaden the mind and that sort of thing. And a lot of authors have spoken about how important this can be in terms of unleashing creativity. But this isn't always necessarily the case. If we go to exactly the same place and only spend time with other British immigrants, also known as expats, are we really broadening our mind? No one's denying people's understandable desire to get some sun, but you might well ask what impact those buying up property, which pushes up the prices in Spain, are having on local people there, where the domestic population are then less able to afford housing. At the same time, some of the political dimensions of this seem positive in terms of the free movement of people, within the EU being the most obvious example, but running against obvious problems as they struggle to cope with the migration crisis as people flee wars and persecution abroad from outside the EU countries. The question posed is then, where do these open borders end? And when we talk about globalisation, a lot of this idea is about deterritorialisation. So people state that effectively we have the end of the nation state and that all countries are subject to a logic they can't control as competitions across borders take hold. Although there is some logic to this, the territorial base still matters. The country or the nation state that you're operating in has to support you and provide stable environment that is required to do business in. And apart from anything else, we've had a whole series of measures conducted by states, like quantitative easing, like the bank bailouts. So clearly, the state is, and now the COVID funding as well, clearly the state is very important and they do have agency to act. And there are continuing attempts by governments, continuing attempts by governments in the UK and France to legislate against trade unions, for example. I think it's important in the context of the election of Trump previously and the debates surrounding Brexit that we recognise that the conflict around globalisation isn't just the terrain of the extreme right arguing for xenophobia and closed borders. This is a picture from WTO meeting in Seattle in 1999, and although it was framed as anti-globalisation a lot of the time, a lot of the protests were actually about the negative effects of capitalism across international borders. So it's often difficult in practice to separate out a definition of capitalism as a global economic system and globalisation from the way that people often use those terms. And generally speaking, it wasn't until the late 80s or the early 90s that there was more of an emphasis on international institutions, showing the importance of this as an area for political debate. So the protesters wanted free movement of people, but not free movement of capital. They wanted interconnection, but not exploitation, showing the kind of differences of what globalisation could actually entail. So a lot of protesters quite often are dismissed as fringe groups and that sort of thing, but in reality many of the concerns raised at the turn of the century are just as poignant and relevant today. It's interesting just how large this was at the epicentre of capitalist development, i.e. the United States. Many protesters believe that they have a moral responsibility because of our relative privilege to act to improve the situation. Whilst the Occupy movement was arguably more about domestic politics, this was more explicitly about the treatment of people in other countries and our role within that. This should certainly act to dissuade us that no one cares about this sort of stuff. So for the first quick task, what I'd like you to do is just find an ethical issue for a company that arises as a result of operating in a global marketplace, and just reflect on why your example raises an ethical dilemma. So maybe just taking a couple of minutes to do that. So one question it's reasonable to ask is the extent to which the spoils of globalisation are distributed. So for a very long time there's been a theory that rather than globalisation, what we're actually seeing is triadisation. The overwhelming majority of FDI still takes place between Asia, Europe and North America. As you can see, Latin America and Africa are largely left out of the equation, and to make this more evident, Africa's share of FDI here is shown as less than 3%, Latin America less than 11%, and North America is 20%. And what this maybe shows is that it's maybe not quite as simple as just going to the lowest wage economy. And another issue here is that a lot of the transfers are between rich nations and even between the same corporations over national boundaries. And another point in here is about the very terminology we use and how that's often bound up with ethics as well. In other words, there's a value judgment within our definitions. So you often hear people talking about the third world, the developed world, and all that sort of stuff. And that ultimately is some kind of ethical judgment over the different economies. So probably it's better to be using the geographically problematic idea of the global south to refer to those countries which are poorer, which admittedly are not always in the south. So sometimes when we're thinking about globalisation, it's worth also thinking about what could arguably be considered its opposite. The growth of protectionism, that obviously has its own ethical dimensions as well. So the banking crash in 2008, the Brexit result, the Trump election were held to by many people to be examples of a new era of protectionism. And so often a lot of this is combined with anti-immigrant rhetoric. So Martin Wolf, the commentator from the Financial Times, who was reporting back from the Davos summit, had said that at the time Trump appeared to be intent on replacing multilateralism with bilateralism. That is, replacing agreements with a number of countries with individual deals where the US would fully be able to use all of its influence. Obviously, the nature of trade deals and so on has a knock-on impact in terms of corporate governance rules and everything else, and people might only trade with countries they trust to have those systems in place, or at least it may well be a contributor. Now, obviously, some of this process is being reversed. The election of Biden means that there'll be more emphasis on that kind of international institutions. But the financial crisis in general made investors more risk averse and less willing to part with their money. So obviously it's not just corporate governance which makes people able to invest, but a broader sense of kind of political risk and so on as well. And it's worth saying that the kind of global economy has been in trouble long before the ongoing COVID pandemic. Another kind of interesting development within this is that countries that are locked into competition just don't trust each other. Governments are increasingly concerned about the potentially non-commercial objectives of investments by state-owned enterprises or sovereign wealth funds, and about the lack of potential reciprocity in terms of the market for corporate control in the country of the investor. Multinational enterprises may also face a resurgence of restrictions on outward investment from their home country, and the influence that other countries gain over your vital infrastructure becomes quite an important question, and this tendency of distrust only increases in the context of low rates of economic growth. So in the discourse of Brexit, there's been a lot of kind of discussion about the ethics of different trade agreements, and the relationship with the United States has been a big part of this. Now, obviously, trade has ethical implications. For one thing, who you trade with is an ethical question, as it's about how power is exercised when these agreements are drawn up. Now, for the US, trade contributed to about 30% of GDP in 2014, and that's lower than for its competitors like China and Germany, giving it greater bargaining power in negotiations over trade. You also have to take into account the fact that the US has military power which overwhelms everyone else. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, even if you add up the next 10 top military expenditures across the world, the US still spends more than them. This includes China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, India, the UK, France, Japan, and Germany. Now, obviously, this grants you a certain amount of influence in terms of trade deals, so we can question maybe the basis of some of these agreements. Now, obviously, just because one country might be harmed less by protectionism, it doesn't mean that they aren't harmed at all. So, taking this wider context then into account about whether the spoils are equally shared, who has power and influence, and whether protectionism may actually be far worse, how else do we assess the ethics of globalisation? So the idea of doing more good than harm, could be one maxim under a utilitarian perspective, but that hardly seems good enough, even if there were a great deal of good for a US multinational, for example. Do we value the individual countries or people who are negatively affected? And often with mainstream uses of utilitarianism, these things are measured in pounds and pence. So it's not always clear that this would do the job. We could also look at virtue ethics. Are people's motivations to do good? Are they in it to help the poor? Generally speaking, it's assumed that the rising tide lifts all boats, so there's an implicit agreement about the ends that we are pursuing. However, the evidence would seem to question some of this assumption. The main theory here tends to derive from this concept of trickle-down economics, that we have specialisation, efficiency, and that therefore importing can be more efficient. And ultimately, the idea is that we have lower costs and greater choice for the consumer as well. So being able to get different foods at different times of the year, or cheap, good quality clothing might be cited as evidence of the benefit of that model. As I indicated earlier, however, there's clearly unequal power between countries, and you can look at the EU Common Agricultural Policy and Africa, where the EU lavishes subsidies into the EU's biggest landowners at the expense of millions of the poorest farmers in Africa. That 30 billion a year subsidy allows the EU to dump thousands of tons of heavily subsidised food into Africa every year. As a result, local producers cannot export their products because they compete with the lower prices made possible by the cap. Multinational enterprises have much more power and economies of scale than small companies in global south countries as well. And it's also the case that international organisations like the IMF and the WTO look out for the sectional interests of the most powerful, since the powerful have their own organisations, including the G7. And a more serious charge is perhaps that the poor don't actually benefit at all, but even if they do, the gains are certainly not equally distributed. So one of the arguments that companies often make is that they're helping to use their influence to encourage new institutions, bringing their ideas over to improve the situation, and that ultimately it's in their interests to have a stable business environment. What's quite interesting about the discussion about globalisation is that it's not always true that it's simply the lowest wages being chased. There are a lot of other considerations. For one thing, political risk and having a relatively healthy and educated workforce. And I guess this second point kind of depends on how many people are unemployed and how replaceable employees are when they fall ill or cannot work any longer. But when we're discussing this idea of the race to the bottom, what we're often talking about are kind of weaker laws on employment as well as wages, weaker laws on pollution and health and safety. And I guess a kind of test for ethics in some of these scenarios is whether or not you use drugs perhaps that may aid health but have important side effects. If you wouldn't sell them in the host country, but you would sell them somewhere else, I think that poses some very real ethical problems there. A number of you have probably heard about the kind of ongoing discussion about things like chlorinated chicken coming over from the US, but what that discussion is ultimately about is about the weaker standards of consumer protection that exist in the United States and the implications of that in the event of different trade deals. So there's much more to it than just the cost of labour. So when people kind of look at the ethics of globalisation, they ask whether this is the market working effectively or the unethical taking of advantage by these companies. Companies argue that they are giving jobs to people who wouldn't otherwise have them, that they pay at market rates, and in fact, in some occasions, they actually pay higher than the rest of the economy. Usually, countries are desperate for foreign direct investment, which means the companies have a lot of influence in that country, and the threat of leaving gives them power in the host country, even if they often don't follow through with the threat. So one area that causes particular controversy is the relationship between different governments and cooperation, and perhaps one of the best examples of this was in Shell's operation in the Nigerian oil fields in the Niger Delta. In 1990, the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, Mossop, was led by environmental rights activist Ken Saro-Wiwa, and he started campaigning for a fairer share of oil wealth for the Ogoni people living on the oil fields and sought compensation for environmental damage. In 1993, there was a protest of 300,000 people against Shell and oil pollution, and at that point, Nigeria's military government occupied the region. In 1995, the leaders of this movement were executed by the government on alleged murder charges. At this point, Nigeria was suspended from the Commonwealth, and there have been some suggestions that Shell was involved in some way. The best reading is probably that Shell didn't want this to happen, but effectively allied themselves with the Nigerian government, a military dictatorship, and hence were supporting a military crackdown. A report commissioned by Shell on the problems in the Delta concluded that they needed to look at, quote, how we sometimes feed conflict by the way we award contracts, gain access to land, and deal with community representatives. The Ethical Affairs Committee of Royal Dutch Shell Bradford Hoop accepts some of the blame in the following video. So if you just pause for a second, watch the short clip here. It's important to place this in the context of just how well publicised this was at the time and the amount of pressure within and outside Nigeria for Shell to take some responsibility. So just kind of following on from that example then, I just wanted to try finding some information on a controversy involving a company and a government of a particular host country. So we just take a few minutes to try that quick task. So what if a country demands that you use unethical employment practices or asks you to direct your investments to benefit their political supporters? Or what if your very presence in a country is questionable? These are the sorts of questions that were asked of companies that were investing in South Africa during the apartheid regime. So in 1977, Leon Sullivan, a director for General Motors, who had a subsidiary in South Africa, proposed a set of principles for governing its business there. They amounted effectively to refusal to obey the apartheid laws. So there would be no segregation in the plant, and staff would be paid and promoted on merit. A number of different companies signed up to this, and the idea being that if they had strength in numbers, it would prevent prosecution. Now, obviously, by 1987, apartheid still hadn't ended, and at this point, they started arguing for withdrawal. General Motors sold its holdings in South Africa, and in 1991 they started to repeal these laws, and in 1994 Mandela was elected president. But the question is whether or not they were simply bound to kind of wider pressure within political society, and whether they should have been there at all. There have been a lot of cases raised against companies because they helped apartheid. So, for example, IBM were said to have supplied the computers to the regime. I should state that ultimately the case wasn't successful, but it's interesting looking at the relationship between different companies and these governments. So another ethical discussion about globalisation is this idea of cultural diversity. So quite often when people talk about Coca-Cola, and so on, they talk about having the same product everywhere. There's something recognisable there. You also get this idea with McDonald's, although maybe sometimes they'll tailor it slightly to the local market. So, for example, in Greece, McDonald's have mostly lamb burgers. So people often argue that this kind of standardisation is a positive thing, that you know what you're getting because you trust the brand, for example. But is the presence of these companies expanding available choices? Kerr and others say that standardisation and those benefits are part of enjoying being part of a global village, that people freely choose, and if the companies meet the demand, then so be it. It's interesting though, because for one thing, it surely reduces choice if local companies go out of business, on the one hand. And Naomi Klein, in her book No Logo, argues that they replace culture and education by marketing. That this whole idea of consumer choice isn't about rational decision making, but about emotion. Symbolism and so on are used to hide underlying oppression. For example, when you buy a coffee from a high street coffee chain, you're buying the status and values associated with it, not just the coffee itself. It's about the ambience, the music, the atmosphere, and so on. And coffee that you buy could be made from far lower quality coffee, but they sell you the brand ultimately. Ritzer takes a slightly different position, arguing that it's the wrong type of rationality that we are using, that we see consumption as an end in itself rather than pursuing a good life, as Aristotle would have argued. So ultimately, the argument there is that we are pursuing the wrong goals. So just to summarise some concluding thoughts on this lecture then, there are increased expectations from globalisation that are often not met by actual conditions. The distribution of any gains are often questionable, and that ultimately our views on globalisation are going to depend on which aspects of globalisation you want to focus on.